Hmm. Lust and love are not the same thing. It's very common in our cultural purview to try to conflate the two, and it's really tragic. Before you make any inward conclusion about anything, and before you take anything for granted, the wisest thing to do is always to take something, hold it out here, and examine it, and go to the root. If you've never taken lust and examined it and gone to the root, then you don't know what it is. If you've never taken love and looked at it and gone to the root, then you don't know what it is. If you've never taken anything and looked at it and gone to the root, then you don't know what it is. If you take lust and look at it and go to the root, what is it? What is it made of? Let's look at it together. Lust is an emotion, isn't it? First of all, it's an emotion that, like all emotions, demarcates. That means it creates a box, an object. Everything that you can see and call by a name, with the senses as well as with thought, with the mind, is an object. However dense or however subtle, it's an object. And so this is why we speak of objectification in relationship and in worldly affairs, people objectifying one another, people objectifying themselves. But look at what it means to objectify. Literally, it means to make an object out of. What's an object? There's only an object if there's a subject. And what's the relationship between subject and object? The subject is the controller, and the object is the controlled, right? The subject is the doer, and the object is the done to, that which is having something done to it. It's the subject that beholds the object, or the subject that holds the object. So, to make an object out of something is to essentially, first and foremost, make a psychological object out of something, which is what? It's to basically put something in a box, categorize something for the sake of utility, for the sake of personal gain, personal pleasure, the fulfillment of personal desire. And it's always, if you look at it very carefully, linked up with, you could even say it's the same emotion as greed, as pride, as wrath, anger, because there's always anger and pride and vanity and the desire to control, to possess, along with lust. In fact, that's what lust is. So, where there's lust, there's the desire for personal gratification, and therefore ignorance of what's actually there. If you see a human being for what a human being is, there's no way for you to simply see the body. It's impossible. And for you to see a human being as they are, with all of their pain, sorrow, trauma, hurt, and to see the situation of the world with all of its hurt, its trauma, its pain, the brutality, the way that the world, refusing to face its hurt, the way that people, who are the world, refusing to face their hurt, cast that hurt upon others in order to avoid facing it, feeling it. And so the way that humans use each other, abuse each other, exploit each other, and then take for granted that situation, call it the human condition, and then continue to perpetuate it and allow it to be perpetuated against themselves, and taking solace in the fact that they can perpetuate it against another. All of that is part of lust. And so, where there's lust, really there's wrath. When you lust after something or after someone and you don't get them, right, which already implies that there's an object, a psychological object has been made, then you become angry, you become depressed, anxious, disheartened, jealous, not only of them, but jealous of whoever you think has gotten them, or whoever has their attention, or their heart, or body. If you even care about the heart, you may just want the body, which is often the case. And you see also that you're envious of them. When you lust after somebody, in a way you wish you were them. You wish you could live the life they're living, have the body they have, get the attention they have, and everything that goes along with that. Have the stuff that they have that you attribute to them having because of the way they look or because of the way people are attracted to them, and so on. So if you look at the nature of it, you see it comes from delusion. It comes from ignorance. It comes from not seeing what's there, actually. And anyway, lust is a kind of violence. I know you might not like to hear it, but there's a way in which you've made an image, you've contrived an image. You say, I like blonde hair, or I like blue hair, or red hair, or green hair, orange hair, whatever hair, it doesn't matter. Blue eyes, brown eyes, yellow eyes, purple eyes, it doesn't matter. This kind of skin, that kind of skin, this kind of body, that kind of body, you have an image. And then you take a bunch of images and you make a composite image and say, that's what I want. And then you go looking for it. In total ignorance of the fact of the person, of the human being, who has pain, who has fear, who has trauma, who has hurt. And you don't want any of that. You don't want to face that. You don't want to deal with that. You don't want to deal with the reality of that, because you want what you want. You want to possess somebody, you want to own somebody, you want to control somebody, you want to sustain yourself energetically on somebody, and you want them to sustain themselves energetically on you. You feel like you can't live without them, and you want them to feel like they can't live without you. Right? And so, naturally, there's neuroticism. It's naturally neurotic. It's naturally greedy. It's naturally selfish. It's naturally... And when they do something you don't want or you don't like, you get angry. They look at somebody else, you get angry. They have their own life, they have their own friends, they have their own support system outside of you, you get angry. Because you want them to depend on you and you want to depend on them. And you think this is normal, and people call this love. And you see how incredibly insane it is, how sentimental it is, how it has nothing to do with love whatsoever. It has nothing to do with intimacy whatsoever. And it really has nothing to do with true attraction whatsoever. True sexual attraction, true sexuality, has to do with intimacy, which is something completely different from lust. Lust and intimacy have nothing to do with one another. In fact, when there's lust, there can be no intimacy. Because when there's lust, you desire. That means you want something. When there's true intimacy, there's nothing that you want. In intimacy, there's no barrier between the two, in the form of thought, in the form of desire, in the form of emotional vampirism. There's nothing there. There's nothing mediating. Intimacy means a naked soul. And anyway, if one person inwardly, you, not anybody else, not considering another for a moment, but you simply alone, capable of being totally naked with yourself, completely, there's intimacy. And when you know intimacy with yourself, you simply can't settle for anything less than that. And so if there would be another, that other must be one who is willing to be in intimacy with themselves. Otherwise, you see, there's no relationship. There can't be. There can never be a relationship between two egos. It's not relationship, it's a hostage situation. So where lust is involved, where greed is involved, where envy is involved, where wrath is involved, where pride is involved, there can be, where the desire to possess, to control, to dominate is involved, there can be no relationship. There is no relationship. But you call it relationship. People call this relationship. But it's not relationship. And you can tell yourself whatever story about it that you'd like, but it's not relationship. True relationship is relationship with oneself, is relationship with what is, and only with relationship with the source of being itself, which is discovered here when one is able and willing to stand totally naked in one's own presence, without fighting, without resisting, without explaining, without rationalizing, without justifying, without analyzing. Which means total self-acceptance, actually as you are. Which means dropping your ego structure, your personality structure, which is devised as a tool to keep you from simply being with yourself as you are. Your whole ego structure, your whole personality structure is devised as a tool, as a technology of resistance against your true self, in order to be considered appropriate or likable or so-called lovable or acceptable by people around you who anyway have abandoned themselves for an artificial self. Because the true self is accepting of the true self. And if you know the true self, you know all self, because the true self is one. It's the same here and there and everywhere. We all have the same true self. It's only in ego consciousness that there's the belief that we have different true selves. That has absolutely no viability in perception whatsoever. Obviously, the bodies are what they are. Each nervous system is what it is, but the true self, to come into direct awareness of that, that's true intimacy. And it's much more profound than sex. And most people, that's about 97% of the world, lives in total abject resistance to the true self, and to simply sitting here with the true self as it is. And so, when you live in that kind of resistance against the true self, you live in violence, you live in arrogance, you live in greed, you live in a total lack of compassion, where everybody else is there to be used and abused and exploited by you in some way or another. About 49% of the world, we've just reached this tipping point, but about 49% is so violently caught in ego consciousness that they've basically made the choice, doomed themselves to not seeing, and there's no point in trying to so-called wake these people up, or you must simply leave them. And the very wake of light will ripple out and touch them. And anyway, they are simply playing their part. So, for the 51%, and even out of that 51%, really only about 2%, roughly, are really here and present and in awareness of themselves. this really takes something else, and in it you see that the emotion of lust is a kind of virus that is used against people to destroy them and to bring them down from the inside out, and to confuse it with love, and therefore to cause people to put their whole sense of self-worth and security in sexual relationship. And the very fact that sexual relationship is made to be the crucible of security, as well as validation, acceptance, keeps everybody in a place of total insecurity and invalidation and not accepting the self. It's impossible for a lust and personal gratification driven sexual paradigm of relating to ever bring about a sense of fulfillment or security or validation or anything meaningful. When you're locked in that paradigm of psyche, you're chasing illusions, and you're trying to drink from a pool of illusion. When engaging with another who is in that state, in that space, and authentic intimacy, true intimacy, does not require the touching of bodies. That may come to pass, but intimacy can never be ruined or destroyed, especially not by a lack of physical contact. It's got nothing to do with intimacy. Speaking doesn't even have anything really to do with intimacy. It's a vehicle. And so speech as meaning as a vehicle, vibration is something else, but vibration simply emanates from one's being. And if the speech be true, it carries that vibration, it matches that vibration. But speaking is a vehicle, speech is a vehicle. Sexuality is a vehicle as an outward expression. Inwardly, it's for oneself. The union of masculine and feminine within one, that is the true sexual alchemy. Sexuality as an outward expression is a symbol, is a metaphoric movement reflecting the alchemy that must take place within oneself. And this is something the whole world is very frightened of, because it means that the world has no more power over you. No one can make you feel frightened by questioning your manhood or your womanhood, your masculinity or your femininity, because you see that the world doesn't know what those things mean. The world's understanding of masculinity is distorted. The world's understanding of femininity is distorted. And so all the cultural politics really has nothing to do with it. And you see how the world doesn't want to be questioned. The world is carried on in its distortions for thousands of years now. And with not even a decade's worth of questioning, its reactions are to just continue reflecting, projecting its own distortions onto the ones who are revealing the insanity of the distortions that have been the bedrock of our self-understanding, our false self-understanding, and our civilizational structures now for many thousands of years now. And the only way to really see what is to withdraw completely. To withdraw the senses and to withdraw the mind, thought and emotion completely. And to look at yourself and see what is the way it is. That means to see yourself wordlessly, thoughtlessly, conceptualistly, without any idea or theory or speculation or psychoanalysis, to put all of that aside because it's all garbage. And to simply sit here in the raw. Without words, without judgment, and to see the truth of what you really are. Which is purely the source of all creation. Playing every role. And the first mistake that people make, which is consciousness itself, and the first mistake that people make is identifying with the body. And then associating the appearance of the body with certain ideas, concepts, theories, cultural ideals, which run totally counter to the reality of being, which is rooted in formlessness, and therefore uncategorizable. And yet the deteriorated, distorted mind, the psyche, seeks categorical security and safety, which is the sign of a very sick, twisted, unwell, diseased mind. What you are is eternally beyond category. I wonder if you know this. I think very few people, though people love to use language, and they love to play devil's advocate, and they love to fight, spar with words, I think very few people really know what words mean. I think very few people are really acquainted with etymology, and even fewer people are aware that words are merely a means to meaning, and that all words, by all words, something deeper, more profound than the word itself is meant. But I think most people don't know that. They don't care to know it. People would rather stay in the domain of words and argue than go beyond words and discover what actually is. So, speaking of words, and we use the word category, do you know that the word gender, that English word gender, comes from the Old English, Middle French, so on, going back to Latin, the word genus. And in between that Latin genus and the English gender, the Middle French, from which the modern English gender comes from, is genre, a word which we still use in modern English today to refer to musical category mostly. Now imagine the human body is an instrument, say a cello. Or a piano. Makes no difference. The instrument itself, the form, that would be the equivalent of the biology. How many genres of music can be played on a cello? Well, that's a skill issue. The cello or the piano or any particular instrument, by virtue of its physiology, is not confined to any particular genre. In fact, any genre can be played on practically any instrument. There may be physical limitations to the range available on any given instrument, but how any given instrument is played is absolutely and totally a skill issue, which is a matter of perception, keenness of observation. So, how many genres are there? Classical and jazz? Is that it? What is classical? What is jazz? How many genres are there? Conceivably. You can continue crafting more and more and more. Because what do you mean by genre? You mean a recognizable and identifiable pattern. And when you talk about the instrument itself, how do you know a cello from a violin, from a viola, from anything? Because of a discernible, recognizable pattern. And how do you know that that cello is playing classical? How do you know it's playing jazz? How do you know it's playing rock? How do you know it's playing hip-hop? How do you know it's playing tribal or indigenous? How do you know it's playing country? How do you know it's playing ska? Anything. How do you know? Because you're recognizing the pattern of vibration. And what happens when you see an instrument that you've never seen before? Physically. There's no pattern recognition, therefore you can't say what it is, you don't know. And what happens when you hear a composition of sound, a particular pattern of sound, that you've never heard before? What can you call it? What genre does it belong to? You don't know. And so with human biology, that is the physiology, that's the instrument, the cello, the violin, right? You have male physiology, female physiology, and intersex physiology. These are physiologies. That's a fact. And the way these things are parsed are often quite superficial. The 4 principal sex markers of a human being are external genitalia, internal genitalia, chromosomal sex, and gonadal sex. And there are plenty of people who have external penis and testes, and internal ovaries, or external vagina and internal testes, and so on. There are different combinations and permutations thereof. So, when it comes to simple perception of anatomy, on a base level, on the most basic of levels, you can begin with male physiology, female physiology, and intersex physiology, with all of their variations. The minute you begin speaking of gender, genre, what are you speaking of? Essentially, you're speaking of particular composition of energy, the basic energies of masculine and feminine. And if you perceive the nature of these energies, yin and yang you could call them, you see that masculine energy has very little to do with the male physiology, and feminine energy has very little to do with the female physiology. In fact, what you see clearly is that everything that is physically manifest is equally yin and yang, masculine and feminine. Everything that's manifest, every human body, every animal body, every book, every cloud, every tree, every worm, everything, every atom, every speck of dust, everything that is physically manifest is equal proportions, masculine and feminine, in its basic composition. If it weren't, it simply couldn't be here. It wouldn't exist. So when people begin speaking, mostly, commonly, of masculine and feminine, they're speaking of their social understandings. They're speaking of their social ignorances, their conditioning, which goes back thousands of years, which anyway changes from place to place and time to time. But obviously, the social understanding of masculine and feminine has nothing to do with the eternal natures of those energies. And the beautiful, the marvelous thing is that for those who know these energies firsthand, who are not frightened of them, as long as you're frightened of truth, that is, as long as you're frightened of discovering the true nature of masculine and feminine energies and their real relationship, as long as you're frightened of that, which means as long as you're frightened of being either masculine or feminine, or rather of feeling masculine or feminine, really it's both. If you are a so-called man and you're frightened of feeling feminine, or if you're a so-called woman and you're frightened of feeling masculine, then you'll never know what the real thing is. And when you discover the real thing, you see they're not separate energies. They're one. Socially divided, but they're not different energies. You can't draw a line between them cleanly at all. And the moment you think you can, you're operating out of a distortion. You have a twisted, a distorted perception, understanding of what these energies are. And one who lives in such a distortion could only be violent, cruel, brutal, ignorant, unintelligent, quite frankly stupid, incapable of thinking, because without the proper awareness of these energies and an actual inner surrender to the fact of the immutable nature of the very energy of the source of creation, you don't even have the capacity to perceive what thought is or what emotion is, because there's resistance and therefore division. Thought gets identified with masculine culturally, emotion gets identified with feminine culturally, but there's no difference between the two. Thought is emotion, emotion is thought. Thought and emotion are one, and they are desire. And if you're frightened of thought, if you're frightened of emotion, if you're frightened of desire, you'll never understand them. You'll never see what they are. And so, if you're frightened of losing your masculinity, or if you're frightened of losing your femininity, one, you never had them to begin with. But also, what can be lost? What can be lost? So, there's fear, which is propped up and propagated by the people around you, who have their ideas of what something means, and then attempt to conform to those ideas and wish to see you conform to those ideas. And out of fear you conform. And that very fear is ignorance. That very fear is a prison. That very fear keeps you blocked from seeing the truth of what it is that you really are, and the nature of the very energies of the source of creation itself. You're blocked because you're afraid. And in that fear you become violent, and you see something or somebody that doesn't fit your understanding, and you lash out and you seek to kill them. And that's the truth. When you see something that deviates from your belief, you want it dead. You want to kill it. And in that, you don't see that you're killing yourself. Because that other is you. You can never say that you are masculine and not feminine, or that you are feminine and not masculine. You have all the energies of God inside of you. You have all the energies of creation inside of you. Calling the source of creation he is just grammatical convention. You must understand this and grasp this very basic fact. The source of creation is not a person. Everything that is a reflection of the source of creation. The source of creation contains everything, excludes nothing. Giving it a gender is just a capacity, a technology of the human being to be able to intellectualize it. The very act of which is totally unnecessary for one who is in it. The intellectualizing is for the ignorant. All intellectualizing is for the ignorant. Analysis is for the ignorant. Dividing the self is for the ignorant. Dividing God is for the ignorant. Dividing energy is for the ignorant. Discernment means perceiving that which is true, which is that which is eternal, and that which is false, that which is untrue, meaning that which is temporary, that which is projected by thought, created by thought, which is fear. Why are you afraid? Why are you afraid? What are you afraid of? If you're afraid of losing yourself, it's because you don't know what yourself is. What you are can never be lost. It's impossible. If you knew yourself, you wouldn't be afraid of anything. That doesn't mean that being fearless doesn't mean being aggressively or belligerently confrontational. That's still fear. That's fear. When you're not afraid, when there's no fear, there's peace. There's an all-pervading deep calm. Because there's an awareness of that which is eternal, of that which is never born and never dies. You're aware of the deathless, immortal nature of your own being. And that has no genre. It contains all genre. It can be confined by no genre, and it's altogether beyond being a part of any genre or no genre at all. So you can say it's both masculine and feminine. It's neither masculine or feminine, and it's altogether beyond being either, both, or neither. And that is you. When a human being is operating in full intelligence, a human being doesn't need psychological categories in order to operate. People only need to see themselves as being a man or a woman because they're ignorant of themselves. You only need to know whether that one out there is man or woman or this or that because you're ignorant of yourself. Why do you need to know? That's a man, that's a woman, that's a Christian, that's a Muslim, that's a pagan, that's a Buddhist, that's a... Why do you need to know? What bearing has that? It has no bearing. Only if you're ignorant does it have a bearing. So why do you need to know if that one has a penis or if that one has a vagina? Because you want to know how to best objectify. That's your only motivation. When people meet, sometimes people ask, are you straight or are you gay? Why? Why do you need to know? What does that mean anyway? Why are you intent always upon sex? You see, human beings are obsessed with sex. And then they project their obsession onto the other, the so-called other. And if you're paying attention at all, if you see clearly, you know exactly what it means to project your sex onto the other. You see, hatred and lust go together. Lust, anger, envy, anger meaning wrath, right? Hatred. These go together. Human beings are so superficial when they're in this ego consciousness. They're so transparent, and yet they believe themselves and their superficiality to be so hidden, so profound, so deep. Someone thinks that they can sit here and say, I'm this and not that. And if you call me the other, I'll kill you. Thinking that that actually causes any wise perceiver to believe what it is that's being said. In wisdom and truth, there is no other. That's clear to all who see. In every man there is a woman, in every woman there is a man. If there weren't, there'd be no attraction. And yet you hate yourself for being attracted to what you're attracted to, because you hate yourself for being what you are. And so all your relationships become superficial, based on posturing, based on keeping up an image out of fear, because you're afraid of parents, family, you're afraid of hell, you're afraid of God, you're afraid of heaven, you're afraid of the neighbors, you're afraid of the so-called community, you're afraid of whatever, whoever. You're afraid. You're afraid. And yet that very fear does not keep the lust, the greed, the envy, the wrath, the hatred, the arrogance, the pride. It doesn't keep it away. It only causes you to continue doing it behind closed doors, or even out in the open, in ways that are considered socially sanctioned, while on the other hand turning around and openly condemning it and trying to incite violence against others who are openly, simply being themselves, enjoying themselves, living their life. All while really wishing you could be that, and doing it anyway behind closed doors, you see? And so it breeds hypocrisy. When you live that way, pretending to be divided, pretending to be separate, pretending to be split, you can only ever live in hypocrisy, and great hypocrisy. And you think nobody sees it because you think you can scream it away and yell it away and refuse it and refute it away. You cannot. It's there, and everybody sees it. It's not. There's nothing hidden. I wish you'd understand that. There is nothing hidden. Nothing is hidden. Everything is seen as clear as crystal, as plain as day. So, if you would really come home to the truth of what you really are, and therefore cease the inner conflict, the inner warfare, the inner struggle, then you must be willing to put down your arms. You must be willing to cease fire against the imaginary creatures you've created in your own head and projected out onto the world and onto others, in your ignorance and your lack of understanding and your lack of desire to understand. And of course, unless you're really willing to understand, unless you want truth more than anything, you have to want truth more than you want to be right. You have to want truth more than you want safety and security. Because you see that anyway, without truth, there's no real safety or security. There's only bullying. There's only mob violence. There's only the status quo. There's only the temporary and false safety net of so-called tradition. so-called culture, which is nothing but a cardboard cutout propped up in the sand. And so if you would find out what is true, you have to go beyond everything, beyond all contrivance, beyond all convenience, beyond all convention, beyond all culture, beyond all tradition, which is always false anyway, because it's never really that old. 100 years is nothing. 1,000 years is nothing. 2,000 years is nothing. 10,000 years is nothing. And all the so-called traditions, which are 1,000, 2,000 years old, and therefore claim antiquity, were but children arriving on the scene in the face of cultures of even greater antiquity and longevity, dating back thousands and thousands of years earlier, with much more variety and much more intelligent capacity, much more awareness of technologies inwardly, outwardly, and which even themselves were still in the midst of corruption. And so the corruption's never left, it's never gone anywhere. So each of us as a human being has to see that truth, that means with that which is whole, that which is complete, is infinitely more valuable than corruption on any level. And so that if one wants truth, one has to stand alone. Not as a man, not as a woman, not as a Christian or a Hindu or a Buddhist or a Muslim or a Jew, not as an American or a Canadian or a Mexican or anything. You must stand completely alone. Not using any culture, any system, any tradition as your storehouse of ammunition. Otherwise, you can never know love. You can only know sentimentality, violence, the desire to possess, to control, to conquer, in order to feel like something. Because you think you know what something is supposed to feel like. How could you? This whole world is chasing ghosts. The so-called modern world, the so-called ancient world, chasing ghosts. Everyone's chasing ghosts. Willing to kill over mirages, over illusions, hallucinations, delusions, distortions. This is the beast. All of these distortions and illusions, which are mechanical, that everyone's chasing, giving themselves over to, abusing one another, exploiting one another, destroying one another, while considering themselves righteous. This is all coming to an end now. The world will not go on like this. So, love is total self-acceptance. Love is compassion, which means seeing the world the way it is and seeing why things are the way they are. It means seeing the root of the fear, seeing the root of the violence, seeing the root of the lie, of the illusion, of the distortion. Seeing the inevitability of it. The inevitability of its beginning, of its rise of its sustenance and of its fall, because all walls fall. All distortions come to an end. And truth stands alone as a testament to itself in pure stillness and silence. You cannot argue with love. You cannot control it. You cannot besmirch it, belittle it, mock it, demean it, criticize it. You cannot change it. You cannot conquer it. You cannot dominate it. You cannot shut it out. You can close your eyes to it, and then you suffer. And you make everyone around you to suffer. And then when everybody pulls away from you, you scream and you cry. And yet you don't want to uncover your eyes. Love is awareness of what has no beginning and no end, of what is totally still, silent, beyond desire, beyond lust, beyond greed, beyond fear, beyond envy, beyond wrath, beyond hatred. Total self-acceptance, the capacity, the ability to sit totally still. Without conflict. And therefore the realization, the direct perception of one's inseparability from everything. This is the homecoming. This is the returning to the original nature. This is where everything is going. This is where everything comes from. And this is inevitable. This is a message of what is inevitable. Whether you like it or not, it makes no difference. And who loves, loves it. Who hates, hates themselves. And loathes to hear it. All are a part of you. You are a part of all. To pretend otherwise is to live in the darkness of ignorance. To be ignorant of the eternal laws of consciousness and of the cosmos.